Imagine going to bed at night, not in the comfort of a mattress or soft pillow, but on a pile of straw infested with fleas. The walls of your home aren't insulated or painted, but are made of rough stone or wattle and daub, barely holding off the cold. There's no glass in your window, just a wooden shutter. You're not thinking about tomorrow's to-do list, but whether you'll survive the night without a raid, a fire, or an outbreak of plague. Welcome to medieval life, gritty, brutal, and far removed from the romanticized tales of knights and castles. This isn't a fantasy. This is history, and it's far darker than most people ever realize. In this series, we'll uncover 5 truly shocking facts about life in the Middle Ages. Truths so disturbing, they may just keep you up at night. We start by immersing ourselves in the everyday reality of medieval existence. The first thing to understand is that survival wasn't a given. You didn't assume you'd live to old age. In fact, the average life expectancy for someone born in the medieval period was shockingly low, around 30 to 35 years. And no, this wasn't because everyone died at 30, but because infant mortality was catastrophically high. Many children didn't live past the age of 5. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and violence wiped out countless lives before they ever had the chance to grow. Imagine giving birth in a small, candlelit room with no sterile equipment, no trained doctor, no anesthesia, just the hope that you and your baby would survive. Many didn't. For women, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death. Now consider what it meant to be a peasant. This made up the majority of the population, and their lives were bound by harsh feudal laws. Most peasants didn't own the land they worked. They labored endlessly on farms that belonged to a lord in exchange for the right to live on it. If crops failed, which happened often, they could face starvation. There were no supermarkets, no food banks, and no government assistance. Your entire survival depended on the harvest, the weather, and the whim of your landlord. And hunger wasn't seasonal, it was chronic. Even in good years, diets were shockingly limited. Bread made from coarse grains like rye or barley was the staple, often contaminated with ergot fungus, which could induce hallucinations or death. People drank ale instead of water, because water sources were often contaminated with feces, dead animals, or runoff from nearby farms and workshops. The stench of medieval towns is something modern minds can barely comprehend. Waste disposal didn't exist as we know it. People dumped their waste, human and otherwise, into the streets. Chamber pots were emptied out of windows. You could be walking down a narrow alley when a bucket of filth was tossed onto your head from above. Streets were rivers of muck, attracting rats, dogs, and disease. Bathing was rare, not just because water was hard to come by or cold, but because it was believed that bathing too often could weaken the body. Many thought diseases entered the body through open pores, so they stayed dirty to protect themselves. Imagine living in a place where almost no one bathed regularly, where your skin itched with lice, and your clothes were never truly clean. And then, there's the ever-present threat of violence. Law and order were often enforced not by professional police, but by local lords or militias. Justice could be brutal, swift, and public. If you were caught stealing, you could have a hand chopped off. Accused of witchcraft or heresy, you might be burned alive. And trials weren't fair by any modern standard. Trial by ordeal was common, being forced to hold a red-hot iron or thrown into water to see if you sank or floated. Floating meant guilt, because it was believed the pure element of water would reject a sinner. And if you sank, well, you were innocent, but you also drowned. Damned either way. Let's talk about housing. A typical medieval peasant house was a one-room hut with a thatched roof and no chimney. A central fire pit provided heat and a place to cook, but the smoke had nowhere to go. It filled the home, darkened the walls with soot, and damaged the lungs of everyone who lived there. Children, especially, were affected by the toxic air, and many suffered from chronic respiratory problems. Homes were shared with animals, chickens, pigs, even a cow because it was too dangerous or cold to leave them outside. So the line between living quarters and livestock stalls blurred completely. The scent of dung mixed with smoke and sweat made for a suffocating environment. Education was almost non-existent for the majority. Reading and writing were skills reserved for the clergy, the nobility, and the very few who could afford a monastic education. Most people never learned to read a single word in their entire lives. The church held an iron grip on knowledge and dictated the flow of information. Books were hand-copied and rare, often chained to desks in monasteries. This meant that superstition and ignorance thrived. Illnesses were blamed on demons, curses, or God's wrath. People believed in werewolves, witches, and omens. A miscarriage might be interpreted as divine punishment. A hailstorm, witchcraft. There was no scientific understanding, and religious leaders used fear to control communities. Now, let's enter the terrifying world of disease. The most infamous, of course, was the Black Death. The plague swept across Europe in the 14th century and wiped out an estimated 25 to 50 million people, about a third of the entire continent's population. Imagine your town being reduced to silence as corpses piled up in the streets. Entire families died overnight. The disease was so fast-moving and so deadly that some people went to bed healthy and were found dead in the morning. Boils the size of eggs formed in the armpits and groin, oozing blood and pus. Fever, vomiting, and unbearable pain followed, with death soon after. There was no cure. Doctors wore long, beaked masks filled with herbs to filter the air, but they were powerless against the disease. Mass graves were dug. Churches couldn't keep up with the funerals. Fear and paranoia tore communities apart. People turned on each other. Families abandoned the sick. Entire villages were left deserted. And yet, despite all of this, people found ways to live, to endure, to sing and laugh and love. There were festivals and market days, religious feasts and weddings. Community bonds were essential to survival. But make no mistake, life in the Middle Ages was a daily battle against nature, sickness, hunger, and oppression. Your fate could change with the seasons, with the Lord's decree, or with the sudden arrival of illness. There was no guarantee of safety, no comfort in the modern sense. Death was ever present, and life was uncertain. And perhaps that is the most shocking fact of all, how incredibly fragile it all was. We look back now, and often view the medieval period through the lens of fantasy knights in shining armor, castles perched on hills, courtly love, and noble quests. But the truth is far less glamorous. The reality was dirty, painful, and terrifying. Every meal, every winter, every illness could be your last. And somehow, against all odds, people carried on. This was a world without modern medicine, without social safety nets, without rights as we understand them today. And yet, they survived. Somehow. In the coming parts, we'll dive deeper into the specific horrors that define this era. We'll explore the psychological weight of living in constant fear, the cruelty baked into systems of power, and the extraordinary measures people took just to get through each day. These aren't just facts. They are echoes of the past that remind us how far we've come, and how much was sacrificed to get here. So if you're ready to keep going, to step further into the nightmarish beauty of medieval life, stay tuned. Because we've only just begun. If you've ever woken in the middle of the night to the sound of wind rattling your window, or a creak from the hallway, and your heart started racing, you know something of the fear that lived in the bones of every man, woman, and child in the medieval world. But for them, that fear wasn't a fleeting feeling. It was a permanent presence. There was no such thing as a completely safe place. Whether you lived in a village, a castle, or a monastery, danger was always nearby. And more often than not, it came not from outside invaders or marauding armies, but from within. The systems, beliefs, and people who shared your life. Let's begin with the church. In the medieval period, the church was not just a religious institution, it was the ultimate authority. It dictated the rules for how you lived, what you believed, what you ate, and even when you could have sex. It determined when you worked, rested, celebrated, fasted, confessed, and mourned. To be excommunicated wasn't just a spiritual punishment, it was social death. People feared hell with such intensity that they would obey the most extreme demands of the church, even if it meant sacrificing their health, happiness, or freedom. One of the most horrifying aspects of this control was the way guilt and fear were used as tools of compliance. People were taught that sin was everywhere, and that even thinking the wrong thoughts could condemn you for eternity. Imagine growing up in a world where you believed every impure thought was being recorded and judged, where demons could inhabit your body, and where dying without confession might mean burning forever. This wasn't metaphorical, it was literal to them. Artwork in churches depicted graphic scenes of damnation. Corpses boiled in cauldrons, souls were skewered by demons, and sinners were dragged into eternal flames by grotesque creatures. This created a state of psychological siege. People were terrified not just of dying, but of dying with sin. They rushed to confession before battle or childbirth. They paid indulgences literal money to reduce time in purgatory, and they obeyed church laws with desperate zeal. Priests, meanwhile, held terrifying power. They could read your sins aloud, shame your family, or withhold sacraments that were believed necessary for salvation. The fear was total, invasive, and all-consuming. But the church's control didn't stop at doctrine. It extended into the very structure of medieval life. Consider the Inquisition. It wasn't a single event, but a series of brutal campaigns to root out heresy people who dared to question or deviate from the church's teachings. Inquisitors had the power to arrest, torture, and execute anyone suspected of heresy. And suspicion was, life in the medieval period, was a constant negotiation between hope and hardship, order and chaos. The fabric of society was tightly woven, yet vulnerable to fraying under pressure. To survive in this world required not just physical endurance, but a keen understanding of the social and spiritual landscape that governed every aspect of existence. At the heart of medieval communities was the concept of honor and obligation. For peasants, this meant fulfilling the duties owed to their lord while maintaining relationships with neighbors and kin. These bonds were critical, as isolation could lead to starvation or vulnerability to crime. Families shared resources during hard times, and collective action could secure better outcomes, for example, pooling labor for repairing dikes or communal barns. The village church was more than a place of worship. It was a social hub and a symbol of divine protection. The bell tower's toll summoned villagers to mass, marked important events, or warned of danger. Religious festivals were the calendar's highlights, offering rare respite from relentless work. These gatherings were occasions for feasting, dancing, and renewing communal bonds. Even in times of scarcity, the communal spirit prevailed. Education, while limited, played a subtle role in survival. Literacy was mainly restricted to clergy and some nobility, but knowledge was transmitted orally among peasants. Proverbs, folktales, and songs encoded practical wisdom about farming, weather patterns, and health. These traditions helped communities adapt and cope with their environment. Health and medicine were rudimentary, but vital concerns. Herbal remedies, passed down through generations, were the primary form of treatment. Plants like yarrow, lavender, and chamomile were believed to ease pain and fight infections. Midwives and healers held esteemed positions, especially in rural areas. However, the lack of sanitation and understanding of germs meant that many illnesses were untreatable and often fatal. Childhood was perilous. High infant mortality rates were common, with many children not surviving beyond their first years. Those who did face a tough upbringing, learning the skills needed for survival early tending animals, working fields, or assisting in household chores. Education for children was often practical, aimed at preparing them for adult responsibilities. Gender roles deeply influenced survival strategies. Men engaged in physical labor, warfare, and governance, while women managed households, childcare, and food preparation. Yet women also contributed economically through spinning, weaving, and sometimes trading goods at markets. Widows could inherit property and wield influence, especially in towns, highlighting the nuanced realities beyond strict gender norms. Economic life was a constant balancing act. The medieval economy was largely agrarian, but trade networks connected local markets to distant regions. The movement of goods like wool, spices, salt, and metal tools shaped local prosperity and hardship. Merchants and artisans organized into guilds that regulated production and provided social support. Money circulation increased in the later Middle Ages, enabling more complex economic transactions. However, credit systems were often based on trust and reputation rather than formal contracts. Debts could be devastating, sometimes leading to loss of land or freedom. Social mobility was limited, but not impossible. Skilled craftsmen, successful merchants, or church officials could rise in status, but most people remained tied to the class of their birth. Festivals and fairs sometimes provided rare opportunities for mingling across social boundaries. The physical environment posed constant challenges. Harsh winters, floods, and droughts threatened food supplies. The Little Ice Age in the late medieval period brought cooler temperatures and shorter growing seasons, exacerbating famine risks. People developed coping strategies, including crop diversification, food preservation techniques, and stockpiling grains. War and violence were ever-present threats. Feudal conflicts, peasant revolts, and invasions disrupted normal life. Castles and fortified towns offered refuge, but also symbolized the constant militarization of society. Soldiers, often poorly trained peasants conscripted for campaigns, faced brutal conditions. Civilians suffered from looting, forced labor, and displacement. Religious life provided both comfort and control. The Church's teachings framed suffering as a path to salvation, encouraging acceptance of hardship. Confession, penance, and participation in the sacraments were means to spiritual healing. Yet religious institutions also wielded political power, influencing laws and social norms. Mysticism and superstition filled gaps in understanding. Beliefs in angels, demons, and miracles shaped daily life. Pilgrimages to holy sites were acts of faith and penance, sometimes motivated by hopes for healing or forgiveness. Saints' relics attracted pilgrims and wealth, creating local economies around shrines. Art and culture flourished even amidst struggle. Manuscripts illuminated with gold leaf, cathedral sculptures, and epic poetry expressed the medieval worldview's complexity. Music, from Gregorian chant to secular ballads, enriched worship and communal gatherings. Ultimately, surviving medieval life demanded resilience on every level: physical, emotional, social, and spiritual. It was a world of contrasts, pain and beauty, oppression and community, ignorance and knowledge. The people who lived through it shaped a legacy of endurance and adaptation that still fascinates and teaches us today. Enough. People were encouraged to report neighbors, friends, even family members. And once accused, it was nearly impossible to prove your innocence. Confessions were often extracted under torture methods, so cruel they make the stomach turn even now. Imagine being stretched on the rack until your joints popped from their sockets, or having your limbs crushed in iron boots, or being suspended by your wrists behind your back until your shoulders tore apart. These were standard tools of interrogation, all in the name of saving souls. The irony is almost unbearable. Unimaginable physical suffering inflicted in the pursuit of spiritual purity. But even outside the walls of religious courts, torture and execution were common. Public executions were major events, sometimes attended by entire towns. Hangings, beheadings, burnings, and drawing and quartering were carried out in town squares, not just as punishment, but as a warning. Children watched. Merchants sold snacks. It was entertainment as much as it was justice. The cruelty was normalized. In some places, punishment was deliberately theatrical. For example, traitors in England were hanged until half dead, then disemboweled, their organs burned in front of them, before being beheaded and cut into quarters. These parts were then sent to different parts of the kingdom as a warning to others. This wasn't seen as excessive, it was seen as necessary to maintain order. And it wasn't just the state or the church inflicting horror. Communities turned on themselves in times of crisis. One of the most chilling examples of this is the persecution of minorities, especially Jews, during outbreaks of disease. When the Black Death struck, many people believed it was a punishment from God, or the result of poisonings. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells, and entire Jewish communities were massacred. People were burned alive, dragged from their homes, or forced to flee. In Strasbourg, in 1349, nearly 2,000 Jews were burned to death in a single day by their own neighbors. These were not isolated events. Pogroms and purges happened repeatedly. And the horror of it all is how easily fear turns into hatred, and how quickly people look for scapegoats when the world becomes unbearable. Imagine being a member of a small community, raising your children, worshiping quietly, only to be hunted, tortured, or killed because of rumors and fear. Even those with power weren't immune to horror. Life in a castle, for instance, wasn't as luxurious as stories would have you believe. Castles were cold, damp, and dark. Sanitation was poor, and disease could spread rapidly. Power struggles were constant, and betrayal was common. Nobles were often poisoned by rivals or killed in political purges. Women of noble birth were used as pawns in marriage alliances, often betrothed at childhood and married before puberty. Their lives were not their own. And children? Childhood as we understand it didn't exist. From a very young age, children were expected to work, obey, and conform. Noble children were sent to other households as pages or wards, often to be trained in service. Peasant children worked the fields, tended animals, and suffered the same illnesses and hunger as their parents. They were beaten for disobedience and rarely educated. Childhood was not a protected time. It was a vulnerable, dangerous passage that many never survived. Even the rituals of life and death were shadowed by suffering. Weddings could be political arrangements. Funerals were urgent affairs, especially in times of plague, when bodies had to be buried quickly and in bulk. Grave robbers were a problem, and corpses were sometimes exhumed and examined for signs of witchcraft or vampirism. People believed the dead could rise and haunt the living, and so corpses were sometimes mutilated or weighed down with stones. One of the most persistent horrors of the medieval world was the reality of famine. Crops failed with alarming frequency due to bad weather, pests, or war. There were no modern preservation methods, so food couldn't be stockpiled for long. When supplies ran out, people ate whatever they could find: roots, bark, rats, dogs, even the flesh of the dead. In extreme cases, there are records of parents eating their own children. These stories are almost too awful to believe, but they are recorded in multiple sources, across multiple regions. The desperation was that severe. Even medical care, such as it was, often made things worse. Doctors believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and thought illness was caused by imbalances among them. So they bled patients, applied leeches, or induced vomiting. Surgery was done without anesthesia, using knives and saws. Infection was common and deadly. Mental illness was misunderstood and feared. People suffering from conditions like epilepsy, schizophrenia, or depression were often thought to be possessed or cursed. They were locked away, chained, or even killed. And yet, through all this, the medieval world had its own strange beauty. Its music, its illuminated manuscripts, Its soaring cathedrals all emerged from a society that lived under the shadow of constant fear and pain. The resilience of the human spirit in the face of such horror is perhaps the most haunting truth of all. Surviving medieval life was not merely about enduring hardships. It was about navigating an intricate web of dangers, social rules, and uncertainties that shaped every moment of existence. From the moment a child was born, the odds were stacked against them. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Nearly half of all children born would not survive to their 5th birthday. This wasn't just because of disease, but also because of malnutrition, poor sanitation, and sometimes outright neglect or abandonment. Many children were seen as economic burdens in families struggling just to eat, and in some desperate cases, infants were left to die or given away to monasteries to be raised. The birth of a child was both a miracle and a risk. Mothers faced a significant chance of dying in childbirth due to infections like puerperal fever, which spread rapidly in unsanitary conditions. Midwives, usually experienced women in the community, assisted with births, using knowledge passed down through generations. Yet, even with their help, many women succumbed. Funerals for mothers and newborns were common, and the emotional weight of such losses was a shadow over many families. If a child survived, their life was shaped immediately by their social status. Noble children were often separated from their families early, sent to serve as pages in other noble households, where they learned combat, etiquette, and loyalty. These young boys grew up surrounded by the politics and intrigues of court life, their futures tied to alliances and wars they could barely understand. Girls, meanwhile, were prepared for marriage, often arranged at a young age to secure political or economic ties. Their education focused on household management and religious devotion, not personal freedom. For peasants, life was grueling. Childhood was marked by early labor, helping with farming, tending animals, fetching water, and performing chores that kept the household running. Education was scarce or non-existent, as literacy was a privilege of the clergy and nobility. The vast majority of the population was illiterate, relying on oral traditions and communal knowledge. Stories, songs, and religious teachings were passed down by word of mouth, serving as both entertainment and instruction. The village was the center of peasant life, a tightly knit community where everyone knew each other's business. Social cohesion was essential for survival, but it also meant strict enforcement of norms and rules. Deviance, whether real or perceived, could result in ostracism or punishment. Community leaders and the local lord maintained order, sometimes harshly. Food scarcity was a relentless problem. Peasants depended heavily on the success of their crops, which could be ruined by bad weather, pests, or war. A poor harvest meant hunger or famine. During famines, people resorted to eating tree bark, wild herbs, and even animals not normally considered food. In some tragic accounts, parents consumed their own children in desperation. Starvation weakened bodies and minds, making the populace more vulnerable to disease. The social hierarchy dictated not just wealth, but legal rights. Serfs, bound to the land, could not leave without permission and owed labor and taxes to their lord. They lived with the constant pressure of dues, tithes to the church, and obligations that left little for themselves. Lords, in contrast, lived in relative comfort, surrounded by retainers and defended by knights. However, even nobility lived with the fear of rebellion, assassination, or shifting alliances that could strip them of power overnight. Medical care, though primitive, was a vital part of medieval life. Monks and priests often acted as healers, using herbal remedies alongside prayers and blessings. The understanding of disease was limited by religious and cultural beliefs. Illness was often seen as divine punishment or the work of evil spirits. This belief system complicated treatment, as spiritual healing was sometimes prioritized over physical care. Doctors relied on astrology to determine the best times for treatments and believed the alignment of the stars affected health. Hospitals, where they existed, were more like hospice places to care for the sick until they died or recovered, often run by religious orders. The lack of hygiene made infection common and deadly. Amputations and surgeries were performed without anesthesia or sterilization, causing immense pain and frequent death. The threat of violence was everywhere. Feudal wars, border skirmishes, and raids disrupted daily life. Knights and soldiers carried out brutal campaigns, and civilians often bore the brunt. Villages could be burned, crops destroyed, and people killed or taken prisoner. The constant fear of attack influenced architecture. Villages were sometimes fortified with walls or ditches, and families lived close together for protection. Justice was harsh and swift. Crimes, even minor ones, could be punished by whipping, branding, mutilation, or death. Trials often relied on ordeals or confessions extracted under torture. Innocent people were frequently condemned. Public executions were spectacles meant to deter others, reinforcing the power of the ruling classes. Religious festivals punctuated the year, offering respite from hardship. These events combined solemn rituals with communal celebrations, including feasting, dancing, and games. They reinforced social bonds and religious devotion, but also allowed for moments of freedom and expression. Trade expanded over the medieval period, linking Europe with Asia and Africa. Merchants traveled great distances, bringing spices, silk, and new ideas. Markets and towns became centers of economic and cultural exchange. However, trade also brought new risks. Cities were crowded and unsanitary, breeding grounds for disease and crime. Despite all the suffering and fear, the medieval world was vibrant and complex. People found meaning in faith, family, and community. They crafted art, music, and literature that still inspire us today. Understanding the harsh realities they faced and the resilience they showed helps us connect with our shared human story in a profound way. The medieval period was a time marked by contradictions, simultaneously brutal and beautiful, terrifying and hopeful, stagnant yet full of change. As we move deeper into the realities of surviving medieval life, it becomes clear that the very structure of society was a major factor shaping the experiences of those who lived through it. The feudal system, the dominant social order, was a complex network of obligations and loyalties that governed everything from land ownership to personal relationships. At the top of this hierarchy was the king, or monarch, who claimed divine right to rule. His power, though theoretically absolute, was often limited by the need to maintain alliances with powerful nobles. These lords, in turn, controlled vast estates worked by peasants and serfs. The relationship between lord and serf was not one of ownership, but of mutual obligation. Serfs owed labor, goods, and taxes, while lords promised protection and justice. Yet, in practice, this system often led to exploitation and hardship for those at the bottom. The daily life of a serf was defined by relentless labor. From planting and harvesting crops to tending animals, serfs worked long hours with few breaks. Their diets were poor and repetitive, mostly consisting of bread, legumes, and occasional vegetables. Meat was a rare treat, usually reserved for special occasions or the wealthy. The harshness of their environment meant that disease and malnutrition were constant threats, weakening bodies and minds alike. Within this rigid social structure, towns and cities began to grow, offering an alternative to rural life. Urban centers became hubs of trade, craftsmanship, and culture. The rise of guilds organized skilled workers, setting standards for quality and protecting their members' interests. These guilds played a crucial role in shaping medieval economies and social life, giving artisans a voice and fostering a sense of community. Despite this growth, urban life was far from safe or comfortable. Cities were overcrowded, with narrow, winding streets that were breeding grounds for disease. Sanitation was poor. Waste was dumped into the streets or nearby rivers, contaminating water sources. Fires were a constant hazard, capable of destroying entire neighborhoods. Crime was rampant, with thieves, gangs, and corrupt officials making daily life precarious. One of the most shocking aspects of medieval cities was the extreme social inequality, visible in every corner. Wealthy merchants and nobles lived in well-constructed homes with access to fresh water and sanitation, while the poor squeezed into cramped, unsanitary dwellings. This disparity fueled tension and occasional unrest, but also motivated social mobility for some, especially through trade or marriage. Religion permeated all aspects of medieval life, but it also provided structure and meaning amid chaos. The church was not only a spiritual authority, but also a political and economic powerhouse. Bishops and abbots controlled vast lands and wealth, often rivaling secular lords. Clergy were among the few educated people, responsible for preserving knowledge and teaching. Monasteries served as centers of learning, healthcare, and hospitality. Pilgrimages were important religious acts, undertaken by people of all social classes, seeking forgiveness, healing, or spiritual enlightenment. These journeys could be dangerous, exposing travelers to bandits, illness, and hardship. But they also connected distant regions, facilitating cultural exchange and economic activity. Medieval warfare was brutal and constant. Knights in shining armor are iconic, but the reality was far grimmer. Battles were chaotic, with high casualties and little mercy. Siege warfare devastated towns and countryside alike, as attackers starved defenders into submission or destroyed vital resources. The psychological toll on soldiers and civilians was immense, with trauma and loss shaping generations. Women's lives in the medieval world were deeply affected by social status and gender roles. Noble women could wield considerable influence, managing estates and sometimes participating in politics. Yet most women, especially peasants, lived under strict patriarchy, responsible for household labor and child rearing, with little legal or economic power. Marriage was often a means of alliance or survival, rather than romance. Education was a privilege. While monasteries and cathedral schools educated some boys, girls' education was rare and focused on domestic skills. Literacy was limited mostly to clergy and nobility. Despite this, women contributed significantly to culture through oral traditions, textiles, and household management. Medieval art and literature reflected the complexities of the time, religious devotion, courtly love, and the harsh realities of life. Manuscripts, tapestries, and sculptures told stories that reinforced faith, social order, and values. Music and storytelling were central to both sacred ceremonies and secular entertainment. The Black Death stands as a defining moment, not just for its mortality, but for its social and economic impact. The dramatic population loss destabilized the feudal system, leading to labor shortages that empowered peasants to demand better conditions. It also intensified religious fervor and sometimes led to scapegoating, notably against Jewish communities. Despite the hardships, medieval people showed remarkable resilience. They built cathedrals that still inspire awe, created enduring works of art and literature, and laid foundations for modern society. Their struggles and achievements offer a window into human endurance in the face of overwhelmed in the medieval period was a delicate balance between hope and despair, survival and tragedy. As we delve deeper into what it truly meant to endure in those times, one cannot overlook the harsh realities of daily existence, the social dynamics that shaped lives, and the resilience people showed in the face of unending challenges. The era was far more than the tales of knights and royalty. It was a time when common folk faced dangers and hardships that today's world can barely imagine. For the majority, survival depended on their connection to the land. The agricultural calendar dictated every aspect of life. Planting, tending, and harvesting crops consumed the labor and attention of families. The tools were simple wooden plows, sickles, and hoes, but the work was backbreaking. The seasons could be cruel. A late frost or prolonged drought could destroy a harvest, leaving communities vulnerable to starvation. The cycle of hunger and plenty was a constant threat to medieval peasants. The diet of the average person was limited and monotonous. Bread, often made from rye or barley rather than wheat, formed the staple of most meals. It was coarse, hard, and far from the soft loaves we enjoy today. Accompanying it were seasonal vegetables like cabbage, onions, and leeks, and occasionally cheese or eggs. Meat was rare, reserved mostly for the wealthy or special occasions. Fish was more common, especially for those near rivers or coasts, but even that was limited by preservation methods and availability. Preservation of food was a challenge. Without refrigeration, people relied on salting, smoking, or drying. However, these methods could only do so much. Spoiled food was a common cause of illness. People also drank ale or weak beer daily, partly because water sources were often contaminated with human and animal waste, making untreated water dangerous to consume. Sanitation was one of the most shocking aspects of medieval life. Cities and villages had rudimentary or non-existent sewage systems. Waste was typically thrown into the streets or nearby rivers, which served as the main sources of drinking water for many. This practice created a breeding ground for disease. Plagues and outbreaks were frequent, killing large numbers and spreading quickly. The lack of understanding about germs meant people had few defenses against these invisible enemies. Housing was another area where the divide between the rich and poor was stark. Peasants lived in small, cramped huts made from wood, clay, and straw. Floors were dirt, and walls were thin. The hearth was the heart of the home, providing heat and a place to cook. Sleeping arrangements were often communal, with entire families sharing limited space on rush-strewn floors or wooden benches. In contrast, the homes of nobles and wealthy merchants were larger, sometimes multi-storied, with stone walls, glass windows, and more comfortable furnishings. Yet, even these homes were not immune to dangers like fire, which could consume entire towns in moments due to the prevalence of wooden buildings and open flames. Clothing reflected social status, but was generally simple for most people. Wool was the most common material, providing warmth, but often itchy and uncomfortable. Colors were muted unless you were wealthy enough to afford expensive dyes. Garments were practical, designed for work rather than fashion. Clothing was often repaired and handed down, worn until it fell apart. Healthcare was rudimentary and often ineffective. Herbal remedies formed the backbone of medical treatment, combined with superstitions and prayers. Physicians were scarce, and many people relied on local healers or midwives. Treatments like bloodletting and purging were common, but frequently did more harm than good. Hospitals, often run by religious orders, provided some care but were far from modern institutions. Education was limited and mostly reserved for boys destined for the clergy or nobility. Most of the population remained illiterate, learning through oral tradition and apprenticeship. However, the medieval period saw the rise of universities and scholarly pursuits, laying groundwork for later intellectual revolutions. Religious belief was a central pillar of life, providing comfort and explaining the world. Churches were often the largest buildings in a village or town, serving as spiritual, social, and sometimes administrative centers. Religious festivals marked the calendar and offered rare chances for celebration and rest. Despite all hardships, medieval people found ways to express themselves through art, music, and storytelling. From illuminated manuscripts to folk songs, culture thrived even in difficult circumstances. These expressions often carried deep religious themes, but also celebrated daily life, love, and heroism. The struggles and endurance of medieval people reveal a world both alien and strangely familiar, a testament to human resilience and the enduring desire to find meaning and connection amidst adversity. Looming odds. The medieval world was a place where survival was a complex web, woven from the threads of social class, geography, belief, and sheer human endurance. Life's fragility was evident in every facet of existence. Yet within that fragility grew resilience, ingenuity, and a tenacity to endure. To understand how people managed to survive, and sometimes even thrive during these centuries, we need to look beyond the broad strokes of kings and battles and peer into the everyday realities that shaped human lives. At the core of this reality was the land itself. For the vast majority of medieval people, life was inextricably tied to agriculture. Peasants, the backbone of the medieval economy, cultivated fields that were often poor and rocky, using tools like the wooden plow pulled by oxen, which was slow and labor-intensive. The three-field system, rotating crops between two fields and leaving one fallow, helped maintain soil fertility, but yields were still low compared to modern standards. Farming required the coordination of entire communities. Planting season was a communal affair, with neighbors coming together to sow seeds. Harvest time was equally demanding, requiring quick action to gather crops before storms or frost could destroy them. The entire year's survival depended on these periods, and any disruption could spell disaster. The diet of peasants was simple but insufficient by today's standards. Bread, made from coarse rye or barley, was their main source of calories. The bread was often dense and dark, sometimes baked once a week and kept in storage, becoming stale or moldy. Pulses such as lentils, peas, and beans were common and valuable sources of protein. Vegetables like onions, leeks, cabbage, and garlic supplemented the diet, providing some vitamins and variety. Meat was a rare luxury, more often enjoyed by the nobility or during religious festivals when certain meats were permitted. Hunting was reserved for the upper classes, and peasants were often forbidden from hunting on noble lands. Fish, particularly salted or smoked, was more accessible, especially near rivers or coasts. However, preserving fish required salting or drying, which changed its taste and texture significantly. Food scarcity was a persistent threat. Poor harvests caused by bad weather, excessive rain, droughts, early frosts could lead to famine. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was a catastrophe that led to widespread starvation, disease, and social unrest. Families would sometimes resort to eating bark, roots, or even cannibalism in extreme cases. Starvation weakened populations, making them vulnerable to disease outbreaks. Water quality was a major hidden danger. Villages and towns often relied on wells, streams, or rivers for drinking water, but these sources were frequently contaminated by human and animal waste. Without an understanding of bacteria or sanitation, people suffered from waterborne diseases like dysentery and cholera. Public latrines were rare, and waste disposal methods were primitive open ditches or cesspits were common. This filth contributed to the rapid spread of illness, especially in overcrowded urban environments. Housing for peasants was rudimentary. Most lived in single-room cottages made of wattle and daub, a framework of woven sticks plastered with mud and straw. The roofs were thatched with straw or reeds, providing some insulation but little protection against rain or wind. Floors were dirt, and furnishings were minimal: a bench, a table, and straw-filled pallets for sleeping. Smoke from the open hearth escaped through holes in the roof, making interiors smoky and dark. Inside these small dwellings, families slept together, often with animals like pigs or chickens sharing the space for warmth. Privacy was virtually non-existent. During winter, cold and damp permeated these homes, leading to respiratory illnesses and discomfort. Fire was a constant threat, as thatch roofs and wooden walls could ignite easily, and firefighting methods were rudimentary at best. In contrast, the homes of the nobility and wealthy merchants were constructed of stone, or timber framed with wattle and daub, but with thicker walls and glass windows, luxuries in this period. Castles, with their towering walls, battlements, and moats, served both defensive and residential purposes. Inside, the lords and ladies enjoyed tapestries for warmth and decoration, fine linens, and furniture crafted by skilled artisans. Clothing was another indicator of status, but also a necessity for survival. Wool was the primary fabric for most people, with homespun cloth worn in simple tunics, dresses, and cloaks. The rich could afford fine wool or imported silk dyed in vibrant colors like crimson, blue, or green, colors achieved through costly dyes like woad or madder. Shoes were often made of leather, but were a luxury for peasants, who sometimes went barefoot or wore wooden clogs. Children's clothing was similar but scaled down, and hand-me-downs were common. Clothing was expensive to produce, so garments were patched and repaired repeatedly, and fabric was precious. People often wore the same clothes for years, washing them infrequently due to the labor involved and the scarcity of clean water. Healthcare in the medieval period was a mix of herbal remedies, superstition, and religious belief. Local healers and midwives served their communities with knowledge passed down through generations. Remedies might include infusions of herbs like chamomile, rosemary, or sage, believed to cure common ailments. However, many treatments were ineffective or harmful. Bloodletting, intended to balance humors, often weakened patients further. Hospitals, usually attached to monasteries, offered care primarily for the poor and pilgrims. They were more hospices than medical centers, focusing on comfort and spiritual care rather than cures. Surgery was rare and painful, performed without anesthesia or antiseptics, making survival unlikely. Childbirth was particularly perilous. Women faced high risks of complications, and infant mortality was devastatingly common. Midwives were essential, helping to deliver babies and provide care for mothers and infants. The loss of children was so frequent that many families had few surviving offspring into adulthood. Education was limited and closely tied to social status. Literacy was primarily confined to the clergy and nobility. Monasteries and cathedral schools preserved knowledge, copying manuscripts by hand. Universities began to emerge, but most peasants remained illiterate, learning trades and customs through oral tradition and apprenticeship. Religion permeated every aspect of medieval life, providing meaning and solace amid uncertainty. The church was a dominant institution, influencing laws, morality, and social welfare. Parish churches were central to communities, hosting masses, festivals, and rites of passage like baptism, marriage, and funerals. Religious festivals punctuated the year with moments of joy and communal gathering. Saints' days, harvest festivals, and holy days broke the monotony of labor. Pilgrimages offered spiritual journeys that also served as social and economic events. The medieval worldview was steeped in a belief that life was a test, with suffering endured in this world, rewarded in the next. This perspective helped people cope with hardship, giving purpose to pain and death. Yet the medieval period was also one of dynamic change. Towns and cities grew as centers of trade and industry. Guilds organized craftsmen and merchants, setting standards and protecting members' interests. These urban hubs were bustling and diverse, but also crowded, noisy, and unsanitary. Crime and law enforcement were rudimentary. Banditry was common, and justice was often harsh and arbitrary. Punishments could be brutal, including public executions designed to deter wrongdoing. Medieval warfare was constant and brutal. Feuds between nobles, invasions, and crusades shaped politics and society. Soldiers faced harsh conditions, and the civilian population often bore the brunt of conflict through looting, destruction, and famine. Women's roles were largely dictated by their social class, but generally limited by patriarchal norms. Noble women could wield power as regents or estate managers, but most women were responsible for domestic work and child rearing. Opportunities for education or autonomy were rare. Despite these hardships, Medieval people created a vibrant culture. Literature flourished, from the epic poetry of knights to folk tales told around fires. Art and architecture, especially religious, reflected deep spirituality and technical skill. Understanding the full complexity of medieval survival reveals a world far richer and more nuanced than simple stereotypes of darkness and barbarism. It was a time when human spirit and community persisted against great odds, laying the groundwork for the modern world. To fully grasp the experience of surviving medieval life, one must look beyond the surface hardships of hunger, disease, and violence. These factors alone tell only part of the story. The Middle Ages were defined by an intricate interplay of power structures, religious authority, cultural traditions, and social expectations that deeply influenced how individuals navigated their existence. Power was a pervasive force that shaped every corner of medieval society. At the apex stood the monarch, whose authority was often claimed as divinely ordained, the divine right of kings. Yet, this power was rarely absolute. Feudal lords, bishops, and local magistrates exercised significant control over their domains. Their rule was backed by a system of obligations, allegiances, and military might, but also by the complex traditions that governed medieval governance. For common folk, this meant living under a patchwork of authorities, lords demanding taxes and labor, the church dictating moral and spiritual law, and the king's agents enforcing royal decrees. These overlapping jurisdictions could create confusion and conflict, but they also provided some stability in a world prone to chaos. Religion was more than just a belief system. It was the framework through which people understood the cosmos, morality, and their place in the world. The church was a dominant institution that provided spiritual guidance, social services, and education. The daily rhythm of life was punctuated by prayers, masses, and festivals, weaving faith into every activity. Monasteries served as centers of learning and preservation of knowledge. Monks copied manuscripts, maintained libraries, and offered hospitality to travelers and pilgrims. The monastic life was austere, but highly respected, and monasteries were often among the wealthiest landowners. The role of the church extended to governance and justice. Ecclesiastical courts dealt with moral offenses and heresy, while bishops wielded influence over kings and nobles alike. Religious orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans preached among the poor, spreading messages of charity and humility. Survival was also about adapting to social expectations and navigating community life. Villages were tight-knit. Cooperation was essential for farming, defense, and celebrations. Social bonds created a network of mutual aid, but also imposed strict roles and norms. Gender roles were firmly entrenched. Men dominated public life, warfare, and governance, while women were largely confined to domestic duties and child-rearing. However, exceptions existed. Some women managed estates, ran businesses, or took active roles in religious life. The lives of women, though often constrained, were diverse and complex. Education was a privilege of the elite, but slowly expanded with the rise of universities and urban centers. Literacy remained low among peasants, but oral traditions preserved history, law, and culture. Storytelling, songs, and folklore connected generations and sustained community identity. Economic life was undergoing transformation. Trade routes stretched from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, linking Europe to distant lands. Markets and fairs were hubs of commerce, where merchants, craftsmen, and farmers exchanged goods, news, and ideas. Money became increasingly important, replacing barter in many areas. Banking and credit systems emerged, enabling larger-scale trade and investment. Guilds regulated quality and training, protecting the interests of artisans and merchants. Conflict was ever-present. Feudal disputes, territorial wars, and crusades brought violence and upheaval. Armies were composed of knights, mercenaries, and peasant levies. often ill-equipped and poorly paid. Civilians suffered displacement, destruction of property, and famine as collateral damage. Despite this, cultural achievements flourished. Gothic cathedrals soared skyward, embodying faith and technical mastery. Literature, from the Arthurian legends to Dante's Divine Comedy, explored human experience and spiritual themes. Music and visual arts enriched both sacred and secular life. The experience of surviving medieval life was thus a mosaic of hardship and hope, oppression and resilience, despair and creativity. Understanding these layers reveals the profound humanity beneath the historical record. To truly understand the complex fabric of late medieval life and survival, it is essential to examine how the interplay of social change, cultural evolution, and persistent hardship shaped people's daily realities. The late Middle Ages were not a static era, but a time of significant transition, where the echoes of centuries-old traditions clashed with emerging forces that would redefine Europe. One of the defining features of this period was the profound impact of demographic shifts. The devastation, wrought by recurring outbreaks of plague, reshaped populations and labor systems. Entire villages were sometimes wiped out, leading to abandoned fields and disrupted trade routes. For survivors, this meant a harsh reckoning with loss and uncertainty, but also new opportunities in the altered social order. Labor shortages gave surviving peasants unprecedented leverage. Many demanded higher wages or left their lords' lands for better prospects elsewhere. This mobility challenged the feudal bonds that had long tied peasants to their estates. Landowners attempted to reassert control through laws restricting movement, but these measures were only partially successful. The gradual erosion of serfdom began, paving the way for more modern forms of tenancy and labor relations. In towns and cities, the burgeoning middle class reshaped urban life. Merchants, bankers, and skilled artisans accumulated wealth and influence, often rivaling that of the nobility. The rise of powerful guilds brought order and protection for tradespeople, but also enforced strict rules that could limit competition and innovation. Markets bustled with goods from across Europe and beyond, from spices and silks to iron tools and wool textiles. These economic developments fueled a gradual cultural flourishing. Universities, which had begun as ecclesiastical institutions, evolved into centers of broader learning. Scholars studied philosophy, law, medicine, and the arts, drawing from classical texts rediscovered through contact with the Islamic world. The seeds of humanism took root, encouraging a focus on human potential and empirical observation, rather than solely on religious dogma. Yet, religious faith remained central to most people's lives. The Church continued to wield enormous power, both spiritually and politically. However, it faced increasing criticism for corruption, wealth accumulation, and moral laxity among clergy. This dissatisfaction found expression in movements calling for reform and a return to apostolic simplicity. Religious dissent sometimes erupted into conflict. Heretical sects were persecuted, and inquisitions sought to root out deviations from orthodox belief. These struggles highlighted the tension between institutional authority and individual conscience, a dynamic that would have lasting consequences. Meanwhile, the physical dangers of medieval life persisted. War and conflict were constant realities. The Hundred Years' War between England and France devastated regions and populations. Castles and fortified towns dotted the landscape as reminders of a society organized around defense and control. Peasant uprisings occasionally erupted in response to taxation and oppression, often suppressed with harsh brutality. Natural disasters, too, shaped survival. Famine recurred in cycles, caused by poor harvests, climatic shifts like the Little Ice Age, or economic disruptions. Starvation weakened populations and made them vulnerable to disease. The medieval diet was simple, but often insufficient, relying heavily on bread, legumes, and seasonal vegetables, with meat reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. Medicine was a mixture of evolving science and ancient superstition. Physicians learned from texts by Hippocrates and Galen, but many treatments were ineffective or harmful. People turned to folk healers, herbal remedies, and religious rituals to cope with illness. Plague outbreaks tested medical knowledge to its limits, with little success in halting their spread. Family life was the core of social stability. Households worked as units of production and support. Marriages were often arranged to secure alliances or property, but personal bonds and affection also played important roles. Children learned skills from parents, and elder family members provided guidance and care. Women's experiences were diverse, but generally shaped by societal expectations. Noble women managed estates and wielded political influence behind the scenes, while peasant women labored alongside men in fields and homes. Religious life offered alternatives, with many women finding roles as nuns, mystics, or patrons of the arts. Cultural expression thrived despite adversity. Literature expanded beyond religious texts to include romances, epics, and chronicles that explored human experience. Art and architecture reached new heights, with Gothic cathedrals embodying spiritual aspirations and technical skill. Music, from sacred chants to lively secular tunes, enriched both worship and daily life. Leisure and festivity were vital for mental and social well-being. Festivals, tournaments, and fairs brought communities together in celebration, breaking the monotony of work. These occasions often combined religious observance with entertainment, reflecting the interwoven nature of medieval life. Ultimately, surviving medieval life was a dynamic process. It involved adapting to constant change, navigating power structures, and finding meaning amid uncertainty. The medieval people's resilience and creativity laid the foundations for the transformations that would define the modern world.